People like her shouldn't be in rooms like this. The Mandarin words slipped through the air like a quiet blade, smooth, precise, and meant to cut without consequence. No one at the table reacted right away, not because they didn't hear it, but because they assumed it wasn't meant to be understood. The restaurant sat 40 floors above downtown Manhattan, wrapped in glass and gold, where the city lights stretched for miles like a promise only the powerful could afford to keep. Crystal glasses caught the glow of amber chandeliers, and the soft hum of conversation floated between deals worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. At the center of it all sat Ethan Caldwell, a billionaire singer, known for closing nine-figure deals with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. His suit was tailored within an inch of perfection, his watch understated, but worth more than a house in most states, and his voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who had never been challenged in a room like this. Across from him, international investors leaned in, listening, nodding, watching every move he made as if success itself were contagious. And moving silently between them, almost invisible by design, was Naomi Brooks. She carried a tray with steady hands, her posture straight, her expression calm, the kind of calm that comes from years of learning how to exist without being seen. Her uniform was crisp, her name tag polished, but to most people in that room, she was just part of the background, another quiet presence ensuring their glasses never stayed empty for long. When Ethan spoke again, still in Mandarin, a few of the investors chuckled softly, assuming they were sharing a private moment, something clever, something harmless. He didn't look at Naomi when he said it. He didn't need to. In his world, people like her didn't require acknowledgement to be dismissed. Naomi stepped closer, refilling a glass with a precise tilt, the deep red wine catching the light as it poured, her movements smooth, practiced, unshaken. To anyone watching, she was simply doing her job. But what no one noticed, not the investors, not the assistants standing along the walls, and certainly not Ethan Caldwell, was the way her eyes shifted, just slightly, the way her focus sharpened for a fraction of a second as each word landed, clear as day. Because Naomi understood every syllable, every assumption, every quiet insult wrapped in a language he believed was safe. She didn't react. Not yet. Instead, she moved to the next guest, placing a glass gently on the table, her fingers steady, her breathing even, as if the moment hadn't happened at all. And that was the mistake. Because in a room built on power, silence is often mistaken for weakness. But sometimes, silence is something else entirely. Sometimes, it's timing. And what Ethan Caldwell didn't realize, not in that moment, not with the city glittering behind him and a contract inches from being signed, was that he had just handed the quietest person in the room the one thing she needed most. The truth, spoken out loud, in a language he thought no one else could hear. Naomi had learned a long time ago that the most powerful moments were not the loud ones, but the quiet ones that came just before everything changed. She moved between the tables with the same steady rhythm, collecting empty glasses, adjusting silverware, offering polite nods that most people did not return, her presence blending seamlessly into the polished choreography of the room. But inside, her mind was sharp, alert, replaying every word Ethan had spoken, every tone, every assumption wrapped in those smooth Mandarin phrases he thought were invisible. The investors across the table leaned closer now, their interest deepening as numbers appeared on sleek tablets and projections floated into the conversation like promises waiting to be signed. $800 million. That was the number quietly anchoring the night, the kind of number that turned conversations into decisions and decisions into legacies. Ethan's voice carried confidence as he switched back to English, outlining timelines, market expansion, global reach, each sentence crafted to impress, to dominate, to close. He smiled at the right moments, paused just long enough to let the weight of his words settle, the performance of power executed with precision. And still, between those polished sentences, he slipped back into Mandarin, quick remarks directed at one of the investors beside him, subtle enough to feel private, sharp enough to carry meaning. Another soft laugh followed. Another glance that never quite landed on Naomi. She set down a fresh glass of water near his right hand, the condensation cool against her fingertips, her movements measured, deliberate. Close enough now to hear everything. Clearly. Close enough to respond, if she chose to. But she did not. Not yet. Because Naomi Brooks understood something Ethan Caldwell did not. Timing was everything. Interrupt too early, and you become noise. Wait too long, and the moment disappears. But if you choose the exact second when attention peaks, when stakes are highest, when everyone is leaning forward, waiting for something to happen, that is when the truth lands the hardest. Across the table, one of the lead investors, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a careful gaze, asked a question about regulatory risk in international markets. It was the kind of question that required clarity, trust, and absolute confidence. Ethan answered smoothly, but this time, before finishing, he turned slightly and added something again in Mandarin, a quiet aside meant only for his colleague. Naomi caught it instantly. A dismissive comment. A joke about how easily the room could be managed. About how appearances mattered more than understanding. The investor's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, just slightly, as if he sensed there was more beneath the surface than he was being told. Naomi noticed. She noticed everything. She stepped back, giving the table space, her hands now empty, her tray resting lightly against her side. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass, reflections layering over faces, over expressions, over truths that had not yet been spoken out loud. The contract sat open on the table, a pen placed neatly beside it, waiting. One signature away from completion, one moment away from becoming permanent. And Naomi knew, with a clarity that felt almost like instinct, that the next few seconds would decide everything. She drew in a slow breath, steady and controlled, her gaze lifting just enough to take in the entire table, every face, every expectation, every assumption hanging in the air. Ethan reached for the pen, his fingers brushing against its polished surface, ready to seal the deal he believed he had already won. And still, he had no idea that the quietest voice in the room was about to change the entire outcome. The pen never touched the paper. It hovered there, just above the contract, as if even time itself had paused to watch what would happen next. Naomi stepped forward, not rushed, not hesitant, just precise, like someone who had already decided exactly how this moment would unfold. Her voice, when it came, was calm, clear, and unmistakably steady. "Excuse me, sir." It was not loud, but it cut through the room with more authority than anything that had been said all night. Conversation stopped. The faint clink of glassware faded. Even the soft hum of the city outside seemed to disappear behind the weight of those three simple words. Ethan looked up, irritation flickering across his face, the kind of expression reserved for interruptions he did not expect and certainly did not welcome. He was about to dismiss her, to wave her away like background noise, but before he could speak, Naomi continued. This time, not in English. In Mandarin. Fluent. Measured. Unshaken. She repeated his exact words. Every phrase. Every hidden remark. Every quiet insult he had tucked between his polished sentences, now laid bare in front of the very people he had been trying to impress. The effect was immediate. The investor with silver hair leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing, not in confusion, but in understanding. Another executive at the table shifted in his seat, his posture tightening as the meaning settled in. What had once been private was now public. What had been disguised as clever commentary was now unmistakably disrespect. Naomi did not rush. She did not raise her voice. She simply finished the translation, then added one final sentence, still in Mandarin, her tone even, her gaze steady. A clarification, not an accusation. Just the truth, spoken without decoration. Silence followed, but it was no longer the comfortable silence of wealth and control. It was sharp, heavy, undeniable. Ethan's hand slowly lowered, the pen now resting back against the table. For the first time that night, he was not the one guiding the room. The balance had shifted, not through force, not through volume, but through precision. The investor across from him folded his hands, his expression calm but distant now, as if reassessing everything he had heard, everything he had believed just moments before. Trust, once cracked, does not break loudly. It fades quietly, like light slipping through glass at the end of the day. Naomi stepped back, returning to her place beside the table, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, as if she had simply completed another part of her job. But everyone in that room knew something had changed. The contract was still there. The numbers had not moved. The opportunity had not disappeared. But the certainty, the control, the illusion of effortless dominance, that was gone. And in its place stood something far more powerful. Accountability. No one spoke for a full 3 seconds. And in a room where every second usually translated into money, that silence felt expensive. The investor with silver hair slowly leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlaced, his gaze fixed not on Naomi, but on Ethan. Not angry, not emotional, just measured. The kind of look that signaled recalculation. Around the table, subtle shifts followed. A cleared throat. A glance exchanged between two executives. A tablet screen dimmed as someone quietly locked it. The atmosphere had changed, not dramatically, but decisively, like a deal that had already started slipping before anyone officially acknowledged it. Ethan forced a smile, the kind practiced in boardrooms and interviews, controlled, dismissive, designed to minimize what had just happened. I think there has been a misunderstanding, he said, his voice steady, but just a fraction tighter than before. He reached for the narrative, trying to reshape it, to bring the room back under his control. Context matters, and sometimes translations do not capture tone. But the words did not land the way they used to. Because this time, tone had already been delivered. Clearly, precisely, and by someone who had no reason to distort it. The investor's gaze did not shift. Context always matters, he replied calmly, his voice low but firm. Which is exactly why clarity is important. He paused, letting that settle, then added, especially in partnerships built on trust. The word trust lingered in the air, heavier than any number discussed that night. Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the point without fully accepting the weight behind it. His hand moved back toward the contract, not to sign, but to adjust it slightly, buying himself time, recalibrating. Across the table, another investor spoke up, his tone polite, but noticeably more cautious now, asking a follow-up question about internal culture, about leadership philosophy, about how communication was handled within Ethan's organization. The question was simple on the surface, but the implication beneath it was unmistakable. They were no longer evaluating just the deal. They were evaluating him. Naomi remained still, just behind the line of the table, her presence quiet once again, but no longer invisible. Not to them. Not anymore. She did not look at Ethan. She did not need to. The shift in the room was enough. The power that once flowed in one direction had dispersed, redistributed, now resting in the space between perception and reality. Ethan answered the question, choosing his words carefully, emphasizing respect, professionalism, global understanding. Each phrase polished, each sentence controlled. But something subtle had changed. The confidence was still there, but it was now accompanied by caution, by awareness, by the realization that every word could carry more weight than intended. The pen remained on the table, untouched. The contract remained open and signed. And for the first time that night, the outcome was no longer certain. Because in a room built on influence, it was not the loudest voice that decided the future. It was the most credible one. And credibility, once questioned, does not return easily. The room did not return to normal, because moments like that do not fade. They settle, like dust you cannot quite sweep away once it has been stirred. One of the investors slowly closed the folder in front of him, not with force, not with drama, just a quiet decision made visible through a simple gesture. Another reached for his glass but did not drink, his attention still fixed on Ethan, studying him now with a different kind of curiosity, not admiration, not even skepticism, but evaluation. The kind reserved for risk. Ethan noticed it. Of course he did. Men like him were trained to read rooms the way traders read markets, watching for shifts, for patterns, for signals that something had changed beneath the surface. And it had. He adjusted his posture slightly, shoulders back, chin level, recalibrating the image he presented, as if control could be restored through composure alone. Let us refocus, he said, his tone smooth, measured, carefully neutral. We are here to discuss a partnership that brings significant value to everyone at this table. The words were correct. The structure was flawless. But the energy behind them no longer carried the same authority. Because now, every sentence had to compete with what had already been revealed. Across from him, the silver-haired investor nodded slowly, but his expression remained thoughtful, distant. Value is important, he replied, but alignment matters just as much. He glanced briefly toward Naomi, not in a way that singled her out, but in a way that acknowledged her presence, her role in what had just unfolded. Then his attention returned to Ethan. And alignment starts with how people are treated when no one is supposed to be listening. The sentence was calm, almost gentle, but it landed with precision. No raised voices. No accusations. Just a quiet line drawn across the table. Ethan held his gaze, maintaining composure, but inside, something had shifted. Not panic. Not yet. But pressure. The kind that builds when outcomes are no longer guaranteed. He opened his mouth to respond, choosing words carefully, but before he could fully step back into control, another voice joined the conversation. A younger investor, sharp, observant, leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting on the edge of the table. Out of curiosity, he said, his tone conversational, how many languages does your team operate in globally? It was a simple question, but layered. A test. Ethan answered quickly, listing capabilities, offices, regional support, the infrastructure of a company built to scale. But the question was not really about his team. Everyone at the table knew that. The younger investor nodded, then added, and do you personally engage in those markets directly? A pause followed, brief but noticeable. Just long enough for meaning to settle in. Ethan responded again, this time more carefully, emphasizing experience, exposure, leadership presence. But the room had already begun drawing its own conclusions. Naomi remained where she was, still, composed, her hands now resting lightly at her sides. She did not speak. She did not need to. The truth had already been placed on the table, and unlike numbers, it did not require repetition to hold its weight. Near the edge of the table, the contract remained open, its pages perfectly aligned, untouched since the moment everything shifted. The pen beside it no longer felt like a formality. It felt like a decision that required reconsideration. Outside, the city continued moving, headlights tracing lines through the streets below, unaware of the quiet turning point unfolding high above. Inside, the room had become something else entirely. Not a celebration, not a certainty, but a question. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell was no longer the one holding the answer. The air in the room had changed in a way no one could ignore, even if no one chose to name it out loud. It was no longer about projections, or timelines, or market expansion. It was about something less measurable and far more fragile. Perception. And once perception shifts, numbers alone cannot restore what was lost. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, not retreating, but recalibrating, his fingers lightly tapping once against the table before becoming still again. He was thinking now, not performing. Calculating paths forward, weighing words, searching for a way to regain ground without appearing to chase it. Because in rooms like this, chasing control is the fastest way to lose it completely. Across from him, the silver-haired investor glanced down at the contract, then closed it gently, aligning the edges with care, as if the physical act mirrored a decision forming beneath the surface. Perhaps, he said calmly, it would be wise to take a moment before moving forward. The sentence was simple, but it carried finality. Not a rejection. Not yet. But no longer a yes. A pause introduced where certainty once stood. And pauses, in deals of this size, rarely favored the one who had just been questioned. Ethan nodded once, controlled, composed, but this time without the confidence of inevitability. Of course, he replied, his voice steady, though quieter now, less dominant, more measured. We can revisit any concerns. But the room did not move back toward him. It stayed where it was, balanced somewhere between interest and hesitation. The younger investor leaned back, arms loosely crossed, observing, not engaging. Another checked his watch, not out of impatience, but as if marking the shift of the evening from opportunity to reconsideration. Naomi stood at the edge of it all, still in her place, still in her role, but no longer part of the background. One of the executives, a woman seated midway down the table, turned slightly toward her, studying her with a new kind of attention. Not curiosity, recognition. How long have you been studying Mandarin? She asked, her tone respectful, direct. The question landed softly, but it changed the direction of the room entirely. Naomi met her gaze, her expression calm, unguarded. Since I was 14, she replied, her voice steady, her accent natural, effortless. No hesitation, no embellishment, just the truth. The executive nodded slowly, impressed, then asked, formally trained? Naomi shook her head once. No, ma'am. Self-taught. And later through community college courses while working full-time. A quiet pause followed, but this one felt different. Not tense. Not uncertain. Grounded. The kind of pause that comes when people begin to see something they had overlooked. The silver-haired investor looked at her briefly, then back at Ethan, the comparison unspoken but unmistakable. One had relied on assumption, the other on discipline. One had used language to exclude, the other had used it to reveal. Ethan remained still, his expression controlled, but the room was no longer his to guide. Not entirely. The conversation had expanded beyond him, beyond the deal, into something deeper, something that could not be easily redirected. And in that moment, surrounded by glass, by light, by a city that never stopped moving, the balance of power had quietly, completely shifted to someone no one had thought to notice when the night began. The question lingered in the air longer than expected, not because it was difficult, but because it had shifted the center of gravity in the room. For the first time that evening, Naomi was no longer just part of the setting, she was part of the conversation. And in spaces built on hierarchy, that kind of shift does not happen quietly. The executive who had asked the question gave a small, thoughtful nod, her eyes still on Naomi, as if reassessing not just her presence, but everything that had been assumed about her from the moment she stepped into the room. That is impressive, she said simply, her tone sincere, not performative. A few others murmured in agreement, subtle but noticeable, the kind of acknowledgement that carries more weight than applause. Ethan watched it all unfold, his expression composed, but his stillness now carried something different. Awareness. He was no longer just reacting to a moment. He was recognizing its impact. The room had expanded beyond his influence, and pulling it back would require more than confidence. It would require humility, something far less familiar. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table, his voice measured when he spoke again. Ms. Brooks, he said, addressing Naomi directly for the first time that night. It seems I underestimated your abilities. The sentence was controlled, carefully constructed, but it was not quite an apology. Not yet. It hovered somewhere between acknowledgement and strategy, a step taken without fully committing to where it might lead. Naomi met his gaze calmly, not confrontational, not deferential, simply present. You are not the first, she replied, her voice even, her words chosen with care. There was no bitterness in her tone, no edge meant to provoke. Just truth, stated plainly. And somehow, that made it land even harder. A faint shift moved through the table again, not tension this time, but recognition. Because everyone there understood what she meant, even if they had never experienced it themselves. The silver-haired investor exhaled slowly, then leaned forward, his attention returning to the center of the table. This, he said, gesturing lightly between Ethan and Naomi, is exactly why perspective matters. He paused, then added, and why assumptions can be expensive. The word expensive carried a different meaning now. Not just financial, but reputational, relational, long-term. Ethan gave a small nod, this time without resistance. Agreed, he said, quieter than before. The room did not rush to fill the silence that followed. It held it, allowing the moment to settle into something more permanent. One of the assistants at the far end of the room shifted slightly, adjusting a tablet, but even that small movement felt distant, secondary to what was unfolding at the table. Naomi stepped back half a pace, returning to the edge of the space, not withdrawing, but allowing the focus to redistribute naturally. She had said what needed to be said, done what needed to be done. No more, no less. And that restraint, that refusal to overextend the moment, only strengthened its impact. Ethan glanced briefly at the contract, then back at the investors, his posture no longer signaling control, but consideration. For the first time that night, he was not trying to lead the room. He was trying to understand it. And in that shift, subtle but undeniable, the evening moved from demonstration to decision. Not just about a deal, but about character. Because in the end, what remained in that room was not the numbers, not the projections, not even the opportunity. It was the memory of a moment when truth had been spoken clearly, calmly, and at exactly the right time. No one reached for the pen. Not yet. The contract remained where it was, perfectly aligned, perfectly ready, and completely untouched, as if the room itself understood that something more important than a signature had taken place. The silver-haired investor leaned forward again, his hands resting lightly on the table, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet authority that did not need to be raised. "I think it is fair to say," he began, choosing each word with care, "that tonight has given us more than just financial insight." His gaze moved briefly across the table, acknowledging each person before settling back on Ethan. "It has given us clarity." The words settled into the room like a final piece falling into place. Not dramatic, not loud, but decisive. Another investor nodded slowly, then added, "And clarity changes how we move forward." There was no hostility in his tone, no confrontation, just a recognition that the conversation had evolved beyond numbers. Ethan listened without interruption, his posture still composed, but no longer projecting dominance. He understood now that control could not be reclaimed through insistence, only through response. Measured, intentional, real. He exhaled quietly, then leaned forward, his hands folding together on the table, a subtle shift from presentation to participation. "I appreciate the honesty in this room," he said, his voice steady, but softer than before. "And I understand that trust is not built in a single meeting." This time, the words carried something different. Not performance, not strategy, something closer to recognition. He paused, then continued, "If there are concerns, I would rather address them directly than move forward with uncertainty." The statement did not restore what had been lost, but it changed the direction of the moment. It showed awareness. And in a room like this, awareness mattered. The silver-haired investor studied him for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod. "That is a reasonable approach," he replied. "But trust is not only about how you respond when things are easy. It is about how you act when you believe no one is paying attention." The sentence was not a challenge. It was a standard, and everyone in the room understood it. Naomi remained still at the edge of the table, her role unchanged on the surface, but her presence now fully acknowledged. One of the assistants quietly stepped forward and refreshed a glass near her station, an unspoken gesture of respect, small but meaningful. The room had adjusted to her, not the other way around. Ethan glanced in her direction briefly, not with dismissal, not with calculation, but with something closer to consideration. He did not speak to her again. Not yet. But the absence of disregard was its own shift. Across the table, the investors exchanged a few quiet looks, subtle, professional, the kind that communicated decisions without words. Finally, the silver-haired investor reached for the contract, not to sign it, but to close it fully this time, his fingers pressing the cover shut with quiet finality. "We will not be signing tonight," he said calmly. No shock, no reaction, just acceptance settling across the table like a truth everyone had already felt coming. "But," he added, lifting his gaze to meet Ethan's, "this conversation is not over." The distinction mattered. It was not an ending. It was a consequence. Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing it, understanding exactly what it meant. Opportunity had not disappeared, but it had changed form. It would now require something more than strategy to recover. And as the room began to shift, chairs moving slightly, conversations loosening, the city lights still glowing beyond the glass, one thing remained clear to everyone present. The most important moment of the night had not been the deal that almost happened. It had been the truth that could not be ignored. The room began to loosen, but not in the way it had at the beginning of the night. The laughter was softer now, more measured. Conversations resumed, but with a different tone, one shaped not by excitement, but by reflection. Chairs shifted back slightly, glasses were lifted again, but the energy no longer revolved around a deal waiting to be closed. It revolved around a moment that had already defined the evening. Ethan remained seated for a second longer than everyone else, his gaze resting on the closed contract in front of him. The city lights reflected across its smooth surface, turning it into something almost symbolic, not a failure, not a loss, but a pause earned by something he could not ignore. He stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, his movements controlled as always, but now carrying a different kind of weight. Not pressure, awareness. He turned slightly, his attention shifting toward Naomi, who had already resumed her work, lifting a glass from the far end of the table, her posture unchanged, her presence once again quiet, but no longer overlooked. For a brief moment, he watched her, not as background, not as staff, but as someone who had altered the course of his night without raising her voice, without stepping out of line, without asking for recognition. He took a step toward her, measured, intentional, stopping just within speaking distance. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his tone steady, but no longer distant. Naomi turned to face him, her expression calm, composed, the same as it had been from the beginning. "Yes, sir," she replied. There was no tension between them now, no performance, just a moment suspended in honesty. Ethan held her gaze for a second, then spoke, this time without calculation. "You were right to speak up." The words were simple, but they carried something he had not offered earlier. Not strategy, not image, respect. Naomi gave a small nod, not triumphant, not dismissive, simply acknowledging what had been said. "I just repeated what was already there," she answered quietly. And that was the truth of it. She had not created the moment. She had revealed it. Ethan exhaled once, a subtle release, as if understanding that distinction more clearly than before. Around them, the room continued to move, investors speaking in low tones, assistants organizing materials, the evening shifting toward its natural close. But that small exchange stood apart, not because it was loud, but because it was real. The silver-haired investor, now standing near the window, glanced back briefly, observing the interaction, then gave a faint nod to himself, as if confirming something he had already decided. Naomi returned to her work, lifting her tray, stepping back into the rhythm of the room, but nothing about her felt invisible anymore. Not to them, not to anyone who had been paying attention. And as Ethan turned away, moving toward the exit with the quiet composure he had built his reputation on, he carried something with him that no contract could have given him. A correction, not forced, not demanded, earned. Outside, the city stretched endlessly, lights flickering across streets and buildings, indifferent to what had taken place high above. But inside that room, something had shifted permanently. Because power can fill a room. It can command attention. It can close deals. But respect, real respect, is something else entirely. It cannot be assumed. It cannot be performed. It can only be revealed. And sometimes, it is revealed by the one person no one thought to listen to until it was too late.